So on the left of this picture, you see what Europe looks like before the war starts. And then on the right side, you see in 1942 how successful Germany really is at conquering land using those blitzkrieg tactics that we talked about. So this opens up a two-front war. Uh, the Germans are going to launch something called Operation Barbarossa, which is going to be their attack on Russia. Remember, before the war started, Hitler signed a non aggression pact with Stalin, promising not to attack him. He's going to go back on this because he needs the resources. But if you remember all the way back to the early 1800s, Napoleon made a mistake. He decides to invade Russia. Hitler is going to make this same mistake, and the same thing is going to happen. They're going to work their way through Russia. They're going to be very successful at first. You can see that large chunk of land that they're going to take, making their way almost to Moscow. But the same thing is going to happen. Winter is going to hit. Supply lines are going to be broken. They're not going to be able to get food, adequate clothing and protection, and ammunitions up to the front line. So right now, what Hitler did was he divided his troops into two. He has his troops fighting in France and trying to eventually launch an attack in Great Britain to the west, and on the east you have him expanding out into Russia. Now the reason a two-front war is kind of going to be the turning point is because he has to separate his troops in order to do this instead of focusing on one area. So invading Russia is going to be Hitler's major mistake, just like Napoleon years and years earlier, that is going to turn the tide of the war. And again, his attack on Russia was called Operation Barbarossa. As we go to the next slide here, see 1941, Hitler sends troops into Russia. Also in December 1941 is what brings the United States into war. The United States was a neutral country, even though it was supporting the Allies. In Japan, December 1941, Japan is going to have a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, killing thousands of people, mostly military troop, Navy officers, people like that, along with some civilians, and sinking a lot of United States, Navy ships, which is Japan's hope was that they could cripple the United States before they came into the war. It was a preemptive strike. They thought the United States was going to eventually join. So in order to slow the United States down, they attacked Pearl Harbor. So this is what's going to bring the United States into the war on the Allied side, and as the United States prepares to go to war and try to change the tide of what is going on. And there's plenty of different videos you can see of Pearl Harbor, both movie reenactments and so forth, kind of viewer discretion advised for some of those, but surprise attacks kills thousands, sinks many important ships, and this is what brings the United States into World War II. We talked about all those different things. The Lend-Lease Act was basically the United States was supplying military supplies and so forth, other things to the Allied powers. Obviously, this made the Axis powers and Germany and Japan, the other ones, upset because even though they were neutral, they were still supporting the Allied side. Japan also used kamikazes, which stands for divine winds. They were basically suicide pilots that would load up their airplanes with as many bombs as possible and crash into Navy ships targets and other targets to try and take as many people with them. This was more of a strategy towards the end of the war. The United States was doing something called island hopping because they were basically fighting Japan on so many different islands in the Pacific Ocean. They would clear one island, move to the next one, move to the next one. But it was really demoralizing because the Japanese have a very, no surrender type attitude, willing to fight until the last man. And even these kamikaze attempts were these, last ditch efforts to try and turn the tide of the war. They would only give pilots enough fuel to make it to the battle and not enough to make home, just so they couldn't change their mind even if they wanted to. D-Day, or the invasion of Normandy. It's going to be a massive land and sea attack on the beach of Normandy, France, in order to force the Germans back. So the Allies are going to launch this huge invasion on Normandy. Now you have to remember, even though this is in France, the Germans had control of France. They had fortifications. So this was the attempt to try and force the Germans out of France and back across Europe. Many Americans, British, Canadian, and other Allied soldiers died, but were eventually victorious in forcing the Germans back. The opening scene of Saving Private Ryan is basically a scene depicting D-Day, but it is very graphic, very violent, very bloody. So there's really no need to watch that. But that is the depiction if you have ever seen that movie. So this is going to be successful. This is going to start to turn the tide of the war. And from June 6, 1944 on, the United States, Britain, and other Allied soldiers are going to start slowly kicking the Germans out of France and other parts of Western Europe. The Battle of the Bulge in December later of that year, this was Hitler's last, he was losing the war. His forces were being forced back, and this was his last major attack that he was going to try and, push into enemy lines, bulge into the lines and try to reverse the tide of the war. A lot of people are going to die. It's going to deplete Germans of their men, their supplies, their weapons. And after this, it's a pretty steady decline for the German war effort. I also have the Battle of Stalingrad on here because remember, we said this was a two-front war. It's going to last for a couple months, a lot longer than the Battle of the Bulge. But it was Germany's attack on Russia that the Soviets, this is where the Soviets were finally able to stop the German advance and start to push back. So now in 1943, 1944, you have both sides that are slowly closing in on Germany, leading to the end. Like it's very clear to all of the country involved the end of the war is coming. Hitler, knowing this, in an underground bunker, marries his longtime girlfriend Eva Braun and commits suicide with her a few days after getting married. So he commits suicide in 1945. Italy at this point had already dropped out of the war. Mussolini lost power and support in Italy because of how terrible it was going. Adolf Hitler knew he had the Russians closing in from the east and the rest of the Allies from the west. He commits suicide and Germany drops out of the war. But now there's still one country to deal with, and that is Japan. And so far, the United States has been the major country that's been fighting Japan, especially in the Pacific. Like I said, that island hopping. Russia agrees to start helping them as well. But this is the end of a very bloody conflict. A lot of people already have died. So the United States advisors have to figure out how do we end this war as quick as possible with Japan. They're going to decide that instead of losing a lot of U.S. casualties, invading the actual mainland of Japan, like they had to do with D-Day in Europe, that they are going to drop these bombs that no one has ever seen before. So the United States is going to drop the world's first atomic bombs, first on Hiroshima, and they call for Japan to surrender. After doing that, killing tens of thousands of people instantly, and then eventually leading to over hundreds of thousands of deaths. Japan doesn't surrender, and then they drop another bomb in Nagasaki, again, killing people, destroying everything, radiation, and that type of thing. They kill over 130,000 people in just a few minutes, and that's not even counting the people that are going to die later on, and birth defects and things like that are going to affect Japan for a very long time going forward. And these are just some pictures of the primary sources that were taken, showing the devastation from the bombings. Victory over Japan Day, the war officially comes to an end September 2nd, 1945. It ends World War II completely. That picture that you actually see there, very famous, a little bit of background. The two people do not know each other. They were not together. They're never going to be together. I believe she was on a date, going on her way to a date with someone else at the time when everybody saw, that it was the end of the war and what was happening. So just a little bit of information on that. Fighting in the West Pacific comes to an end on the Japanese islands. Italy surrenders. Hitler commits suicide. Germany surrenders. And then the United States drops the atomic bombs and Japan surrenders. That brings us to the Yalta Conference. It was a meeting between what's called the Big Three, the US, Great Britain, and Russia, to talk about ending the war and how to divide up Europe after. Also, after World War II, is going to be created the United Nations, a peacekeeping organization to avoid war. Now I have that little, what is the UN similar to? I'm going to give you 3 seconds to think about it. The United Nations is similar to the League of Nations that was created after World War I. But the United States is going to actually join this time. It's going to have a military to enforce its actions. So the United Nations is the same kind of concept behind the League of Nations, but the United Nations is formed after World War II, replaces the League of Nations, and is much more powerful and is still around today. Also, after the war, Israel is going to become a country. We remember talking about Theodore Herzl and his, Zionist movement, writing the book of Jewish State. In 1948, Israel is going to officially become a Jewish nation. Constant fighting between the Muslims who live there and the Jewish population is going to happen in the years after, and is still happening today. But that is going to see the idea behind Zionism finally recognized and come to fruition after the end of World War II and Zionism or Zionist movement fighting for a Jewish homeland. And you can just see that sliver there where Israel is, showing you where the country is located. The Nuremberg trials are very important. The Nuremberg trials, as any trial is holding people accountable for their crimes. Trials after World War II to punish Nazi war criminals and to punish the leaders of the Holocaust and prevent future acts of genocide. Genocide being a mass killing of a group of people. The major idea behind the Nuremberg trials, everybody's defense was relatively the same. I was following orders. I was told to do it. A lot of these people are going to be found guilty. A lot of them are going to be, executed. A lot of them are going to be thrown in jail, and a few are going to be found not guilty and let go. But the major idea behind the Nuremberg trials is following orders is not a reason to commit these wartime atrocities. That individuals are responsible for their own actions, and we're not talking about regular soldiers that were fighting in the German army. We're talking about, the leaders of concentration camps that are going to be responsible for the deaths of all of these people. So these were the Nazi war criminals that were put on trial, executed or thrown in jail for the genocide and human rights violations that they committed. And the overall message that was sent out after this is you are responsible for your actions. You cannot use it was given. I was told to. I had to do this as a reason to commit these terrible acts. Next, in my next video, we will talk a little bit more about the technology used in World War II and the Holocaust that we've, talked about a bit in between. I hope this is helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.